I'm tossing it over to Tate.
Yeah, thanks, Lexi. And thanks everybody for taking time on a Tuesday evening when I know everyone has other things going on in their lives. But John and I know are pretty excited and have been for the last few months to have this conversation about wargaming complex problems. The alternative title here is sort of broad applications for wargaming methodologies. And go ahead and just go, Lexi, if you would, to the next slide. I think we want to start by just kind of introducing ourselves. I am a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council and also with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. I spent 12 years at Janes, running for a large part of that time strategic assessments and future studies group there. And then before that was at the modeling, simulation, wargame, and analysis team of Booz Allen Hamilton. And prior to that, with the Strategic Assessment Center of SAIC. For the most of my career, in fact, really since the mid-90s, I've been engaged in alternative futures analysis, the application of AFA methodologies, including wargaming, scenario planning, red teaming, and others. And was fortunate enough early in my career to really work for the first decade running scenario planning and futures exercises and wargames with Office of Net Assessment. And have kept up with doing that kind of work ever since. So it's been a big part of what I do, in addition to the more focused analytical work on defense technologies and future military capabilities. But this is the fun part of the job, is design and delivery of war games. So John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tate. Thanks all for coming, Sebastian and Lexi, for having us here. I wish we could be doing this in person, and hopefully we'll be able to do that again soon. But great to talk to you all tonight. So kind of working backwards, I'm currently on an IPA position, which is like a temporary secondment to the Office of Secretary of Defense for policy in security cooperation. So really away from this sort of stuff and away from wargaming, although I'm trying to push a couple of security cooperation wargaming efforts there while I can. Before that, I was and still am a fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is where Tate and I first met, although we've connected in a couple of other ways as well. And I've been there in some form for 4 or 5 years, and I've actually worked with some of you that are on the call in that capacity. Before that, I worked at a little, very micro consulting firm called Noetic for about 5 or 6 years. It really, most of its work it did for OSD, AT&L, and there was a particular futures team within that that put a lot of money and investment into new technologies and new ideas for technologies. And we were something of like the policy skunk works. So all the other groups they funded worked on the widgets. We kind of came up with the ideas for how you would use them and where you would use them, what the problems might be, and what else they should be thinking about. And in that capacity, I did a lot of kind of unconventional wargaming then with people like Dave Cullen and Peter Singer and August Cole, which is really kind of where I started down this path. It's about 10 years I've been doing these sorts of non-traditional and unconventional games. Prior to that, I was in the Australian Department of Defence for about 4 years as a staff officer, and I was in the Australian Army Reserve for 12, including the last 2 as an exchange officer of the National Guard here in the US. So mostly defence, a little bit of private, a little bit of think tank, a little bit of public, jack of all trades, master of none.
Great, thanks, John. So we're going to be switching off a little bit as this brief goes on and kind of, as John says, riffing off each other. We put together about 11 or so slides that I think lay out kind of how one of the interesting ways, at least we think it's interesting, we hope it is to you as well, ways that we use war games in supporting not just defense organizations, but also private sector and even some non-governmental organizations. We've worked together, as John mentioned, for about 3 years designing games both through the Atlantic Council and other mechanisms. So we have gotten to know each other strengths and weaknesses pretty well, and I think hopefully we'll be able to connect and cover for each other today. So
unfortunately we should probably stop, because every time we do the nightmare scenario we develop ends up coming real in about 6 to 12 months. So I think we should probably stop doing war games.
Yeah, we have a I don't know if it's a good or bad track record, but we have a track record. So I want to start with talking what we mean by wargaming, because one of the things that we both have experienced, and I think is probably really pertinent to this call, is that there's a terminology challenge sometimes when we talk about wargaming, It means a lot of different things to different individuals or communities in different contexts. Obviously, I think the GUWS does incredible work in creating board games and playing board games. And that's not really what we're going to talk about today. For us, wargaming is more of a broad and flexible methodological tool, and it can be applied to support decision-making, strategic and operational planning, risk mitigation for a wide range of organizations. It certainly has, the way that we apply it, some, I'd say, significant intersections with scenario planning, red teaming, and other alternative futures analysis methodologies like devil's advocacy. All of games that we design are, both individually and working with each other, are customized. They have to be, because ultimately there's not one way to design one of these seminar type games that we're talking about. They have to be aligned with the game's objectives and actually with its administrative constraints as well, like how many rooms do you have, simple, mundane things like that. But there are, even in that sort of heavily customized, bespoke design approach, there are some core principles and components to games that we include, and we'll talk about those today. I don't think any of those will be foreign to you, but I hope it is interesting to understand how we apply them when we think about designing games and executing games. And finally, we do want to give you some case studies at the end of this brief. We have, I think, 7 or 8 prepared. We're not going to go into a ton of depth on them for a couple of reasons. One is we want to have a conversation here tonight. We want this, instead of us talking at you for 2 hours, to be discussing with you for at least a part of that time. But these, I think, reflect and demonstrate just how broad the applicability and flexibility of wargaming can be outside of not just sort of military, operational, and strategic games. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this slide almost certainly misrepresents some things, but I think in general, it captures kind of the spectrum of what people, what often get referred to as wargaming in different contexts. And it starts on the left. We call these sort of more creative applications of wargaming, although the first one is futures exercise and scenario planning isn't really technically what we would call wargaming, but it's important to talk about it because frequently war game exercises begin with some sort of scenario planning exercise in which you are thinking about all the, well, not all, but a set of indicative representative scenarios of how the future could unfold. And then after you have some time to talk about those and understand them and figure out which components of those scenarios seem most concerning or most attractive for future opportunities, then maybe those get condensed into a wargaming scenario. But we think that the stuff sort of towards the left end of the spectrum are a little bit more creative. Their focus is more diagnostic. It's on understanding the forces that are shaping the future and the motivations for decisions and actions. They're a little bit more expansive in terms of trying to develop and consider new strategies or approaches that maybe not have been considered before. And I think one of the really big values here, as we'll talk about later in this brief, is this offers an opportunity to challenge assumptions. Not to say that those things aren't happening across the spectrum, but this is really the core value that these types of exercises I think provide. Once we get to the middle of this, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I mean, for perspective, I mean, the reason we started out talking about where we came from was because that heavily shapes, you know, I mean, war gamers are kind of like musicians, right? You get a certain style or a certain riff that you like to use, and we tend to stick with it and evolve it. But, you know, it fundamentally kind of sounds like ourselves, and we all have that we bring from our background. For mine, part of the reason I got into these more unconventional and kind of open-ended side of things was actually the original war games that I started to do when I got here for OSD. Started out in the much more, you know, rigorous, constrained, rule-based, tabletop type game, and we found that when we were trying to talk about something that was, you know, hard to understand, that was complicated, that there were many layers to that you know, like it was not fully understood, that they were just too constraining, and so we deliberately drove to that side of the spectrum to become more creative, to release some of those rules. And so that was, you know, where I got there was not actually like wanting to stay, you know, start there and stay there, but because there was an actual benefit to it, right? And this side of things often gets derided as bog sats, and, you know, frankly, you know, there is some truth to that, but any war game that's done for the wrong reasons or without the other elements that we're going to talk about later, like objectives and you know, clear thinking on the methodologies, can be a useless, you know, box ticking activity. I think the problem is that there's more art to this side of the spectrum than the other. There's less science to it. There's less kind of like follow the bouncing balls to construct it. And what that means is that if someone doesn't have the experience or doesn't fully have the other elements, it can, go off course very quickly and very easily and become kind of pointless. But I just wanted to emphasize there's a reason for them. And we got, or at least my path into wargaming went that way specifically because of the benefits inherent in that sort of approach, which is that creativity and the diagnostic and the expansive and all those things that Tate talks about. And I think that often gets lost in that discussion about the different types of war games.
Yeah, it's a great point. And we're going to focus most of our time on this seminar style wargaming, which is probably, it's not a term of art. It's something that we've come up with. Maybe others use it, but I think it's a pretty descriptive term where, it's a little more informal. Obviously, you have to design in rules. Sometimes those rules are very important. Other times they're less so. But the idea is to get people talking and thinking and answering questions and getting them out of their comfort zone by putting them into a scenario that is disconnected from real world environments most times. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of time. We'll also talk a little bit about matrix games, which John is an expert in and far more expert than I am. So he will be the one leading the discussion there. But across the board, I think what we see is that games not only suggest, and this is where real value comes in, they can demonstrate in a live and simulated environment how a variety of trends, influences, and forces could evolve and reveal to stakeholders new strategies, approaches, challenges, opportunities, and balances. If they're run well, that's what they can do. If they are not, then maybe that's a little less impactful.
I just want to add one last thing in this. I mean, it's again, this is our simplistic design. I have seen, I think, some of the other presentations, connections and stuff. So I don't think this is entirely original or bespoke to us. But I think the way to think about it here, at least the way I think about it, is rigor is inherently tied to constraint. All right, so the more constraint you have, the more rigor you have, the more you're allowed to do anything. It's very hard to kind of define the metrics and abstract things in a way that makes sense and logical. But also, once you take away constraints, and anyone can do anything, then you lose some value in it. And so, neither end of that spectrum is right or wrong or positive or negative. It's just that the more constraint you add, you do add rigor, but you inherently add or take away creativity, because you're limiting what people can do and what they can think. And, as this will be a theme all the way through, there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's not, this is the right war game, this is the right application for this methodology. It's all about trade-offs between the different types and what is more important to you. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, particularly with matrix games, and one of the case study, that we'll talk about later on. The difference for me between matrix and board games is the matrix game rules are really important for driving it, but they really create a floor from which you then build the war game on. Whereas a board game or a tabletop game kind of creates a ceiling, right? There's a limit to how much you can do. That's just the way I kind of frame it. And then the other element that, again, you're going to hear a lot through this is, I don't know if it still is, but a couple of years ago, there was a lot of debate amongst the MORs, the military operational community, and the connections board game community about, like, where do the Venn diagrams of those two communities overlap? Where is there commonality? Where is there difference? How do you define one from the other? And one thing that was thrown up at Connections a few years ago was human decision making. That's the biggest differential between a mod sim and a war game, is that in most mod sims, you're really tied into exploring how things might happen, in a number of cases, under certain types of models and probabilities. Whereas war games are really about exploring the human part of it, the human dimension of it. And to some of the points that Tate makes about, the boring things like how long do you run a session, where do you put people, how many groups, when do you feed them, because it's human centered. And for me, that's the real key here, is that is really important. And a lot of the war game is actual social engineering. It's understanding who's in the room, who do you invite, not just because of their knowledge, but how they'll interact with other people, who's going to be a good voice, who's going to agitate, who's going to challenge. And really, it all comes down to, and even the facilitation really comes down to a lot of EQ, is be able to read a room, read other people, understanding where to pull at threads, and where to push people on certain issues. But I just think for all that, for all the core commonalities, everything else, you got to remember that wargaming specifically is about the human and the human element of it, and everything else should start at that framing of, what do humans do, why do they do it, and we'll talk about seminar games later on about decision making and such. Part of it is the qualitative, why do you make this decision, or what goes into the decision, as opposed to what decision do you make. And that's, I think, a really important again, differentiation of the different types of war games and where they fit on the spectrum.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. And yeah, let's move on to the next slide. The last thing as we move on to the next slide and transition to it, we think all of these are important. Right? All of these are interesting and important. There's not a bias against matrix games or board games. Obviously, that's a focus of GUWS as well. So, but these are the types of things where we've spent a lot of our careers working on the kind of the left side, center left side of this map. All right, next slide. So why do these types of games? Well, it's a good question. And we think it's kind of a layered value. The most immediate, of course, the things that gets pointed to right off the bat are the analytical values that come out of these types of exercises. And we think there is real value in terms of improving decision-making and probably focusing analytical efforts as well. You can see some of the actual more specific, although still high level kind of focus area or values, challenging prevailing assumptions, obviously testing plans and strategies, which is a core value of war games across the spectrum, kind of a way to explore new environments, anticipate disruptions, and I think critically identify trade-offs and tensions of decisions, which is one thing that we think is really important outside of the defense side. I mean, obviously important in the military sector, but for businesses as well to understand some of the trade-offs and hidden challenges that are out there. But beyond the analytical, there is this bureaucratic organizational one, which doesn't matter whether it's a private or public sector organization. If you go through the process of running a game and you do it sincerely, right, and you don't say, all right, we're going to get this outcome and we're going to engineer the game to have that outcome, which obviously John and I would resist vigorously, but some organizations go through that process to validate things. If you go through that process legitimately and sincerely, then it does tend to establish stakeholder buy-in, especially if those stakeholders are involved in the game process, right? And they've experienced it and lived it. And so that can help support big organizational objectives like changing strategy, right? That's a big thing to do. But I can tell you about one game run with an aerospace and defense company that wanted to do a whole new venture, space-related venture, and we ran kind of a hybrid scenario planning seminar-type war game. And out of that came, a need to change their entire strategy for this new venture and to look at new markets to penetrate. So these are really big decisions that if you go through this process, you may be able to get stakeholder buy-in to facilitate big changes or small ones, but obviously it's a little bit easier to engineer smaller ones. The last one is personal and professional. And for all those who have participated in war games, not all of them are amazing, but I think there's something really enjoyable about being part of one. And you end up making great connections. And some of those connections can be very valuable, especially if you're working on issues going forward that the game pertains to. And now you have a relationship with those people, those individuals. And so it makes it easier. For example, if you really need to work on an issue very closely with them, you've gone through this together, you have a common frame of reference. That's important. I'll tell you about one game that we'll mention a little bit later. It was an emergency responder game, and one of the really interesting things that happened there was that in the game, one of the participants was saying that the scenario we had cooked up was really challenging. They didn't have enough generators to keep their equipment running, and this was a fire chief, I think, and the police chief said, or maybe it was vice versa, said, we got 5 sitting in our basement. We can loan you one. We can give you one. And there was a little bit of horse trading that went on during the game that wouldn't have happened had they had not attended this tabletop. Now it's rare, to be sure, that's not going to happen at all games, but it does, I think it's indicative of the types of positive outcomes, salutary outcomes that can come from the interaction that games.
Yeah, some of the early games I did for Ben Riley in OSD, his kind of philosophy or premise was if you put smart people in a room, smart things will happen. And really it was as much about, having diverse groups of people talking about shared interests over coffee in the breaks as it was the actual gameplay and the outcomes of the game. And I just wanted to pull in a couple other, examples of where this can be valuable. So for one thing, I want to talk about the endothermic, exothermic. So I've had this kind of running metaphor of describing war games a bit like a chemistry experiment in high school, right? So, we'll talk about the different elements of it. But for me, what you're trying to do is create a reaction and to test out a premise, right? So if I, mix this chemical with that chemical, I will produce light or heat or whatever it is. A lot of the design of the war game is about facilitating that reaction. So a lot of the design, a lot of the structure, a lot of the scenario is really just a catalyst to get those elements to kind of compete and combine. And we'll talk later about participants and such. You can't have what's not there. So it's all about who you put into it. But there's also different types of games in terms of there's some that you do because you're trying to learn something. You want to explore a future scenario on behalf of your organization or whoever you're doing the war game for. They want to understand, what might happen. What is a range of outcomes so that you absorb knowledge essentially from the people that are coming. And then the other type of game, which frankly is less satisfying as a game designer, but frankly very important, if not more important, and that's the exothermic. Whereas you're not going to learn really anything much from what the outcomes of the decision making is, but the people who participate are going to learn something from it. They're going to take something away from it. And a good example of that was Tate and I have both run some war games over there. We split the blue team into three different parts of the blue team. There was a parliamentary team, a Ministry of Defense team, and a President's Office team, or something like that. And really, the red team was almost irrelevant, and the actions between them. What we really were looking for was trying to understand the decision making and the interactions of the communications between them. So the red team was not so much a determinant of the outcome. They were a catalyst, right? They were the ones who were causing the friction. The scenario did too, but they were the ones that were causing the friction amongst the three blue teams. And that's what we're studying. So just like a science experiment, you got to understand what it is you're looking at and why, and then you design the activity around trying to do that. So in this case, we wanted to understand the frictions between different aspects of the blue team. And frankly, I got ringed out by a former Undersecretary of Defense. He was like, "That's not how you run a war game. We have one US blue team. We don't have multiple blue teams. That's not a real war game." And I went, "All right, thanks. Noted. We're still going to do it my way." But that was really interesting. And I remember distinctly, in terms of this the experiential thing that Tate was talking about. This young muley came directly up to me at the coffee in the first morning break of the first game, and just walked straight up to me and just said, "Thank God we are doing this now, not under real circumstances, because it would be a disaster and the country would be evaporated." It wasn't a big crisis scenario, but they just had no understanding of the levels of dysfunction or where their problems were or who was supposed to do what. And we did a similar one on the flip side, where we broke the US team into multiple parts to see. And again, similarly, we had very, very interesting interactions. Everyone thought, "Oh, this is ridiculous. That won't work." We're all on the same page until you give people crisis points and decision points. And then you realize each organization, each culture in each organization interprets the problem different, interprets the threat differently, and then develops the approach differently. So, again, it's about deciding, understanding what it is you want to look at, and then how you break those parts, and then understanding who's getting the value. Are you giving the value, or are you getting the value? And sorry, I'll just give one last one for an example on the professional raise awareness. At the Atlantic Council, we did a war game looking at the Palestinian territories, and we did a cholera breakout. This was pre-pandemic. And we actually didn't care what the outcome was, and we didn't care what the gameplay was, and we didn't care what we found out. The point was some of the stakeholders from Europe and elsewhere had become complacent when thinking about the potential risks there. And we just wanted to put it back in front of their face. We just wanted to raise their awareness, get them caring about it personally and emotionally by putting them through that experiential process of looking at what a crisis might look like, not because they didn't know, but because they might have got distracted by other things. So it's just a way of raising the awareness back up. And games can be a really effective way of doing that. You send a letter out, you put out an op-ed, maybe people read it, maybe people go, yeah, I know. We've all been dealing with this problem for 10, 20 years. Nothing's changed. We all know about it, right? But then you put them through that experience again, and suddenly they feel it in a whole different way. Again, it comes back to, it's all about that human-centered aspect.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, John. And I think it leads us into a good coda for this slide and talking about value is this Benjamin Franklin quote, which I think I try and use in just about every game brief I have, but tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, and involve me and I learn. And the involvement that comes with these interactions, I think can be very powerful. Next slide, please. Yeah, so look, this is not rocket science here. We're talking about game elements and design. These are the type of elements, like we said at the beginning, that every game is different. We have to design things based on specific game objectives, first and foremost, and administrative constraints. But every game involves some common components. And And yeah, of course, it involves, team scenarios, moves, interaction, facilitation. These are things that any game would have. I think what hopefully will be interesting here is that, these can be very flexible. So when it comes to teams, some of the most successful games that we have run are not necessarily competitive. It's not red team, blue team dynamics. It's multiple blue teams. And while you don't get competition, you do get friction, right? You get three teams, each taking their swing at the piñata, so to speak, right? Each taking their shot at creating actions or strategies or whatever the tasking is. And sometimes you can give those teams different, different rules, right? And that spices it up as well. But so yes, war games have teams. All war games, really, most games at least, have teams. But I think there's some interesting things that we can do in these sort of more flexible applications that open up the possibilities of how we can examine a problem. Same with scenarios. We sometimes use these scenarios. We have a starting scenario, and of course, it evolves through adjudication, as all games or many games do. But again, we've also found a successful model of, we have a 1 or 1.5 day game, 2 or 3 moves, and each move is addressing a different scenario, which again is not necessarily unique, but I think it's an interesting way for companies or organizations in a very short period of time to begin to examine a broader set of problems and links again back to the scenario planning exercises that you've gone through, and in some cases. Moves, yeah, I mean, a lot of the games that we've run have been pretty straightforward in terms of the move dynamics, which, plenary scenario intro followed by breakout groups, and then plenary, outbrief plenary, which, to be honest with you, is where a lot of the value of these games comes. I know, John, you have a lot to say on this, so I'll turn it over to you with this before doing that, saying that these discussions, because of the questions we're asking, and we'll get to those in just a minute, in the breakout groups, there is a lot of, why are you taking this action? It's not just about, here's the 3 things we're going to do, now let's see if they work. It is a lot of going through the sort of intellectual elucidation of why you're doing these things and how you see the scenario. So, John, I know you've got a lot.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of points I might just kind of drop in this slide. So first of all, I mean, exactly what Tate said. It goes back to the spectrum on the left side of things, and really why facilitation is so important at that point, because a lot of it in some of those scenario games, the scenario and the design are almost irrelevant. They really act as an intellectual anchor around which you can have a diverse group of experts to have conversation, right? And again, it pulls out that experiential part. You're pulling out the unknown knowns, those things that they inherently know and understand, but may not think about or intuit, easily. If you go and ask them, like, hey, what should we do in the Middle East? You might get a really boilerplate answer. If you say, there's been a coup in Jordan and Lebanon's collapsed, and then you draw out really detailed thoughts that can lead you down different paths. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that as well. And I mean, again, it goes back to that human part of the facilitation, right? So one of the games we did, I built the scenarios I often do. I turned to real life events, right, to try and keep it grounded in reality. And we did this, hybrid game where we're looking at Russia, and I plucked out real world events, real world news stories of things Russia had done, and combined them all into a scenario to kind of escalate up. And in this particular game, we ended up at like the brink of nuclear war by lunchtime. And we spent the rest of the game, talking about being agile and such. We had to adapt it and walk it back, and spent most of the afternoon, instead of fulfilling the scenario and continuing the injects, we spent pulling apart how would you de-escalate the situation and what would be required to it. So we completely pivoted off the original game design to go down that path. But we got to the plenary, and the first thing I asked was, like, why did we go to war in this scenario? Because this one happened last week, and that one happened last month, and this one might have been 2 years ago, but we still didn't do any of the things you're now saying. Is it the artificiality? Is it the fact that we're just in a room together for a day talking about nothing else? Is it because the consequence don't matter? This is a large part of facilitation of design and I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I was thinking about it this afternoon. There's kind of 3 A's and T's in game design. So there's assumptions, there's artificialities, there's abstraction, and there's trade-offs. And every game has artificialities. You already hear that, the don't fight the scenario, but there are artificialities. Every game is artificial. By definition, a game is or a mod sim actually is an abstraction of some real world event. that you are then pushing and designing in different ways to achieve some sort of research aim or to answer a question or to explore something, right? So there should never be a need to explain their artificialities. We all know their artificialities, but as a game designer, you have to ask, what artificialities are there? What impact is that going to have on the results? And then what do I need to do to either mitigate them or to shape them or to, ensure that that doesn't undermine everything we're trying to do, or and we could give some really good examples of that when we get to the case studies part. But, I've had a lot of people ask, like, how do you run a war game? What's important in a war game? So it kind of goes to the 5 that Tate's laid out really well here, which are really important. And that is the participants. So, if you ask, what are the most important parts of a war game? For me, participants is number 1, right? Because again, as I said earlier, if you're doing a chemical reaction, you can't create elements that aren't already there. If you add hydrogen, water to something and there's no carbon, you can't get carbon dioxide unless you're also adding carbon, right? There's just no way that you can add elements that don't exist. It's the same thing. If a war game is a way to draw out that subconscious knowledge of the people who participate, you can only draw out the subconscious knowledge of those who are there. And if they're not there, then you're not going to get it, right? You can often get the a benefit greater than the sum of its parts by combining different types, really deep engineering, technical expertise with a policy type person. But you can't have that engineering perspective if the engineer is not there. So a lot of the game design of who comes and what teams are developed and those things that Tay was talking about, it comes down to participations. You need to think about what types of knowledge do you want and how do they combine to get the answers you might need, right? So that's number 1. The second most important part is the facilitation, particularly on the left side of that spectrum. And that might sound a little, arrogant or self-serving, but we've all seen this, and we'll talk about this later. Anyone can make it, can wargame, and anyone should be able to wargame, and I will help anyone who wants to learn to wargame, but not everyone can do it well. And that's not to say that we're better than anyone else or anything else. It comes from experience. It comes from understanding these sorts of things and seeing what works and what doesn't. Anyone can develop a game. Not everyone can develop a good game or can run a good game. And the facilitator is really key for that, because if you have a great scenario and great design, but you have bad participants, you won't get a good outcome, or you're unlikely to get a good outcome. You might with a good facilitator, but probably not. If you have good participants and a bad facilitator, you're probably not going to get a good outcome. They might be better than the facilitator and be able to figure it out themselves. But the facilitator can make up for bad design and bad scenario just by being a good facilitator. You can't make up for a bad facilitator with good design and good scenarios, right? And then, as I said before, you can only have the people you can only learn from the people who are in the room. So that's why that comes first. That's my hierarchy. And again, all these things are important. That's my hierarchy of how you should think about the elements and what makes a good game.
Yeah, and there is some overlap to some of these slides because we'll come to kind of the most important components of a good exercise here in a couple of slides, but certainly facilitation and team composition are right at the top of the list. One thing I'd say on scenarios as well is they don't have to be long. I think we've seen very effective scenarios that are 1 or 2 slides long that just provide the framework of it that get people talking. Some of them are longer. Obviously, if you want a more in-depth type scenario discussion, you need more detail, but more.
Remember the USIP game on Palestine, right? So I'm not a Middle East expert. We had the Middle East team involved in it. I was kind of doing the methodological, but we had a fairly very, very broad scenario, page and a half scenario. And we gave that to everyone. We had former prime ministers of the Palestinian, authority. We had, diplomats. We had, all sorts of, UN officials, some very high level people. No one complained about any single element of the scenario or for any element of the scenario for the 2 days, except the one scenario where I talked about how many trucks would cross a certain border crossing on a certain time at a certain day. The whole room went up in uproar. Yeah. I thought I had desecrated a sacred monument or something. The entire place just exploded because of that one detail was wrong, right? So sometimes, we've all been to those war games where there's not enough detail to make decisions on, but you have to also be careful not to just layer on detail and depth for the sake of it. The question, again, comes back to that thing I'm going to say, what do the people need to make a decision? If they can't make a decision on the information you've given them, then the scenario needs to go into more depth. Right. If it's superfluous to them, then it's not needed and it's probably just going to clog up the system. The only other time you would add it in is if again, what are you trying to achieve? You're deliberately trying to confuse them or flood the zone with superfluous information to see what they pick up. So there's always a reason for doing it, but you need to be really cognizant about why and what and how that might affect the gameplay.
Yeah, and John, great point. Too much information can be a distraction and let people show off what they know. But also I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, the first rule of that exceptionally important facilitation that you communicate at the outset of these events is, you know, don't fight the scenario, whether you think it's practical or not. And I think it's become easier in our current environment to say that things that you used to think that weren't practical or plausible now are. So next slide, please.
I'm actually going to pause us if that's okay, because we have
Sure.
quite a few questions that have come in.
Oh, great.
So the first two questions are about design, and the first one is very eloquent, and I'm going to put it less eloquently at the end. So from one of our participants, what mitigations were undertaken to reduce, resolve, or neutralize any escalation in relational aggression between different blue teams against the problem? And so to me, this kind of reads as, how did you stop blue teams from competing against one another rather than trying to achieve the?
Well, who said we wanted them to stop competing? So I mean, like, again, it goes back to the, you know, what are we trying to do? And you know, Tay talked about the frictions and war games to explore frictions. In some cases, we wanted there to be friction, and again, this goes to the learning aspects. We wanted them to be confronted by how hard it was or how difficult it was, and we, you know, so we want to mess. So again, there's no right or wrong answer to it. I mean, there's a lot of ways we do it. So for instance, I'll give you a game. Rex is online. He'll remember this game because he helped design it for the Atlanta Council a few years ago. We had we wanted to explore US policymaking in the Middle East. And this was prior to the 2016 election. And so we had one scenario that looked at a foreign policy that was more engaged in the region than the Obama administration, one that was less so. And there were some practicalities to it, right? There's only so many rooms and conference rooms and stuff in the building. And we, you know, so we had to have it over 2 floors, split over 2 floors. So the US team that was less engaged in the region, we put on a different floor. So they physically had to move in the escalator up to see any other team, right? Specifically to see, you know, to create that kind of environment that would shape their thinking. So they were removed from everyone to make it harder for them. So in some cases, you might do that. In the USIP one, where we had, where we were playing the Palestinian situation, we had, you know, 2 Palestinian factions representing the different causes, you know, and the different parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But we put them in a divided room. So again, you have practicalities, how many rooms you can use. We put them in a conference room that had one of those sliding boards that you see, right? They were literally feet apart and could probably overhear each other talking. In the day and a half or 2 days or whatever it was you ran that game, they did not speak to each other until the last 10 minutes of the game. They were a foot away. Everyone else had to come from the other side of the building to come and talk to them, to negotiate. They did not talk to each other, despite literally being back to back, separated by some plywood, until the last 10 minutes of the game where I forced them to. Right. And so that tells you something. And that goes to the qualitative side of the scenario wargaming, is sometimes it's not about the outcome of the game or who wins or who loses or what moves they took. Sometimes what you're really studying and analyzing and understanding is the human aspects that go into it, and pull that apart for analysis. Right. So there are a number of ways you could do it. That doesn't give you really a lot of great answers on it. But, you know, sometimes you might not be looking to, you know, to de-escalate.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple of points. One, you know, this is where game facilitation, not just team facilitation, can be very, very effective. Like, you know, you give the tasking at the beginning that this, you know, you state what the objective is, and I'll give you an example, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It was a company trying to get into the U.S. federal market, and they wanted to run a game to understand, you know, what their strategy should be. And, you know, you just remind them at the front that this is about developing a strategy, and you keep reiterating that over the course of the exercise. Every opportunity you get, when I was kind of game master, I would float between the teams and just sort of hammer home the idea that, you know, the folks in the other room are not your competition, that they're, you know, essentially you're on the same team here. We're trying to get 2 perspectives. Now, some people take that more seriously than others. And that would have to be facilitated by the team facilitators. The other thing I say is you can give them different sort of, you know, different assignments or roles within the blue team, right? You can have them emphasize certain perspectives a little bit more. For this case, we could have asked one to be more business development and one more marketing or something to that effect. But we didn't choose to do it on that because it was a good game, although we had that in our back pocket if it came to it. The last thing I'd say is I'm more concerned on 2 blue team type games or 3 blue team type games. The bigger concern for me from a game design perspective is not the teams getting overly competitive with one another. And at times that's not the worst thing, and there are ways to just sort of calm them down. It's the bleeding of mentalities. It's when you go on the coffee break, they talk about what they talked about, and then you've kind of got, I mean, you sometimes you want to maybe keep them separate, have them go on breaks at different times. Don't let them talk to each other during the game, because otherwise you'll get discussions from one team bleeding into the other and potentially, I wouldn't say tainting, but affecting those discussions. So to me, that's a slightly more prominent concern when we're thinking about designing a game like that.
I think that's a really good lead into the next question. So both of you have discussed designing and creating an experiential type of game where the importance of the game is rather what players experience more so than, say, a solution or an actual analytical outcome. Just working through that, what's your process for determining, hey, this is going to be a game where the experience is more important, or this is going to be a game or event where the outcomes are more important?
I mean, I think that partly that comes naturally, but partly it should be pretty obvious from the start, right? I mean, that quite often is the specific, part of the design brief, right? So like some of the tech war games that we might use as examples later on, that were sponsored by DoD, they specifically did it not because of the outcomes, but because they wanted to agitate discussion in the wider community, right? So that was fairly clear that yes, they were trying to learn stuff, but they also wanted to agitate it out. In the USIP game I talked about in Palestine, that was very clearly, exothermic from the outset. Quite often people will come to say either we want to learn what this is, or we want to broadcast out what those elements are. One other thing I just want to say on the kind of the design, and while we're on kind of that design brief, is one of the key elements of designing a game is, and I know we're going to get to this in a later slide because Tate's got it on there, in terms of the objectives and how important that is. But quite often people come to you wanting something, not really understanding what it is that they actually want, right? So one of my very early games was we had a group from the Marine Corps, US Marine Corps. So this was back in 2011 or 2012, there'd been a second army in the desert for the last 10 years. They want to get back to their amphibious roots, and we'd run a war game for a separate project that involved a neo activity in a developing world scenario. Kind of looked a bit like Lebanon 2006, but in Asia. And we had a colonel come to us and say, I want that. I want you to run that so we can prove to everyone why the Marine Corps is still important and how we can do amphibious stuff. And what we said to them was, well, that's not actually what you want. Like, yes, that will tick that box. But what you actually want to learn is, where do you really value add? And so let's design the game differently. And let's ask the question, how would the US government respond, whole of government response to a crisis? And then what role does the military play in that? And then what role can the Marines uniquely run in that? And that becomes endothermic. So it started out as an exothermic. We want to broadcast out that we can do this one role. And we said, yeah, but what you really get to get out of this is actually endothermic. We didn't say those terms back then. But you want to learn what they want to do and what they care about, so that you can figure out exactly where you fit into that puzzle, so that when you go to them to broadcast, you can tell them the answer that they are wanting to hear, right? So sometimes what is exothermic is what is exothermic can be a little bit confusing. And sometimes the people that come to you with the original idea may not fully understand what the value is to them. And that's part of that role of the game designer, is first and foremost, there should be more effort in the front end in determining those things than there should be in the game design and scenario design. You can come up with a scenario by being smart for an hour, but these things take really deep thinking and engagement. And I actually, for some time, have thought there's a lot of overlap between the design thinking process and wargame design. And I've been meaning to kind of examine that space in between, but it's a lot of that. It's a lot of understanding what is it you're trying to achieve, what are you trying to get to, and then the actual design of the war game then kind of falls out naturally by saying, here's the objective, here's what we need to do, what wargaming tools can we apply to it in different ways to get to that end state.
Yeah, there's that, I think it's Stephen Covey book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think one of them is begin with the end in mind. And so, when I think about my process, or a process for wargame design and delivery, it's really got 6 steps: conceptualization, design, preparation, execution, analysis, and then hopefully iteration, because games are more effective when they're iterated. But I think you can't get to any of the other steps 2 through 6 until you get step 1 right, conceptualization. And that's an interactive process with the sponsor, whoever wants to run the game. And it involves asking a lot of questions and keep asking questions about what that sponsor really does want to get out of the game. And from that, you can begin design. And if there is and every game has an analytical objective, we shouldn't just dismiss those as being unimportant to this type of wargaming. We run these things for a purpose. It's to, examine a strategy, all the things we said before. But through that conversation, which sometimes needs to be forced, because there is sometimes, you're the guys who design the games, tell us what we need. Well, we can do that, but we need a little more information from you. And some of that will have to be, what is it you really want out of this? Because we can't design a game that's going to work until we know what problem you want to address and what you want this game to achieve for your organization and the individuals within it.
The flip side to that as well, while we're kind of on that topic, is you have to be kind of firm as well as a game designer. I mean, there's certain people who come to you wanting to do something, and they'll mask it as wanting to be analytical and see what might happen, but really they've kind of got there was one game that I won't go into detail, but was being pushed as a partnership looking in the Middle East, and they said they wanted to see, like, hypothetically what might happen under these circumstances. But what it really was that person had their own scenarios that they'd published and talked about, and what they really wanted was us to get to a validation point to prove them right. And then when the game didn't go down that path and was showing something else, they got kind of frustrated and basically jammed that scenario down. It's just to see what might happen, because what they were really looking for was that validation of their own preconceived notions. And the irony in this is, it was a fairly good game up until that point. We found some fairly interesting, kind of endothermic insights. And if we had, I believe, if we trusted the process, if I had not bent and accepted that compromise, I think we would have got to a point where we would have probably predicted something like the drone attack on the Saudi oil facility, right? It was an irregular game, and I think that probably would have come up based on who we had there and the way the discussions are going. But we didn't, because we suddenly took this pivot point off, where the sponsor kind of jammed down their preconceived notion of what they wanted to do and why. And so, you obviously need to be adaptable and agile, and you always need to find middle ground. But sometimes you need to coax out of them what it is they want, and you need to help them understand what they want. Sometimes you have to kind of guard against or shield the process against their preconceived notions of what they want. And I'll say time and time again, and I'd be interested to hear if any of the war games on here have had a different experience, but I am always shocked by how many times I think something's gone wildly off track, and we'll talk about this in the case studies, and I think that'll never happen. That's getting ridiculous, and people are getting too carried away. And it's, what I call the James Bond villain syndrome, where everyone wants to do the, like, we're going to get a space laser and take over the world. And, I, as a facilitator, have gone, that's really ridiculous. We're getting out of control here. I need to rein it in. And then that thing happened 6 months later. And I'm like, oh, okay. So you trust the process. It's amazing. You never know exactly where a war game is going to go, but you're always going to get something interesting and different. It's very rarely predictive in that sense, but it'll always show you a different light or a different angle or a different perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of or considered.
Awesome. And so I have one more question while we are on this slide, and then we'll have a couple more on slide 7 just for your essay. So this is a kind of terminology level set question. I don't know if we're still in part 1, but part 1 wanted to cover terminology. We have some participants asking about the context in which you're using the wargaming that you're describing. Is this synonymous with tabletop exercising or TTXs? Or are you thinking of TTXs as more of a tech or computer-based simulation?
So I don't think of TTXs as simulation-based. And the wargaming term I see as an umbrella, right? And there's been this debate for years and years and years. And maybe Rex or someone else who's deeper in it and more current on the discussions can come in and help us with that. There's been multiple efforts to define certain terms. The problem is that there are so many people who vaguely understand wargaming that the hardcore people might all agree on a certain set of terminology, but you talk to anyone else. So there's been analytical games, and there's been, I've tried it myself. I've tried finding different terms to mean certain things. Get away from wargaming, because as Tate said, a lot of things aren't war games. They're not war. They're not even conflict in a bunch of situations. But if you just say gaming, and people assume you mean computer, and if you say wargaming, anyone who's been around DoD in any sense anywhere at least gets some idea what you're talking about. So you tend to fall into that easy thing of just saying wargaming and that kind of meaning everything. Seminar-based wargames, most people understand what that means as being that kind of left side of the spectrum. TTXs, I think, is not so many people know matrix games, but that's fairly well defined. TTX is a further right down the spectrum where you're actually talking tabletop. I mean, it's in the word tabletop. You should have some sort of physical representation of whatever and be moving things around in real space, whereas seminar tends to be unbounded. But a TTX, I guess, could be a game, it could be a computer-based thing. But the other thing is where this gets really messy is the combination of those things. I've been working for years on we talk about, we haven't gone to a series of war games yet, but I think that's as important as designing a series of war games as there is one. And some of the war games, you deliberately do multimodal to get somewhere. So one of the ideas I've had that I've been wanting to execute for a while is to find a way to have really tactical, computer-based, almost simulation type games of, fighting a battle out to have that rigor, but then have that inform a seminar-based discussion the next day that will then inform another computer-based tactical game, and to have those series going back and forth so that you're combining the best of two worlds. And for that is I thought hard about it. I've not yet seen anyone find a way to really effectively do that in a way that's practical. I really think you have to kind of break them up into separate games, but that's the holy grail. That's the unicorn, the white whale, whatever you want to call it, is finding ways to connect that unbounded, creative discussion and policy aspects to a really rigorous tabletop. So I think a tabletop is a type of war game, but not all war games are tabletops. Computer gaming can come into that, but that's kind of a parallel track in some ways. But that's just how I define it. Some people will refer to anything that involves two forces at a tabletop.
Yeah, I mean, and I would not object to the. It's just tabletop seems to have a broad, as John mentioned, a broad definition that seems to be applied by different people talking about different things. But I fully accept that frequently tabletops and seminar style games are this roughly synonymous. So it's a good question, but I think it highlights some of the different ways that people talk about gaming and exercises. We actually, I think in this brief, probably used TTX a couple of times as an abbreviation. So there is some crossover there for sure, but we sort of stayed away from it in the definitional phase. I'm not exactly sure why. I think we just sort of had discussions about what it really meant and decided that it might be easier to answer any questions about it rather than build it in there and have people scratch their heads. So thanks for the question. Yeah, so the next slide, we've talked about this experiential sort of game, and the getting there is a big part of the value. And this is some of the things that we ask when we do these games. Well, of course, will depend on the design. That's the constant caveat. But what we want to know when we give teams a scenario, regardless of the type of scenario that it is what's your perception, right? First and foremost, that's the first sets of questions that we're going to ask. How do you see it from whatever role you're playing? How do you see this? How might your competitors or other teams see it? What are the dynamics, advantages, vulnerabilities, asymmetries? Critical uncertainties is another big one. Because it helps us, especially if we iterate on it, it helps us understand and actually in adjudication and building scenarios over the course of kind of a path game, it helps to know those things so you can build more challenging scenarios. Objectives, what do you want to achieve? Again, these are pretty. So much of gaming is getting the simple things right. This is not necessarily particularly complicated, but I think it's important to state that these are the things that we're looking for. What outcomes can you achieve? In what order do you need to achieve them? What outcomes is your competitor seeking to achieve? These are all things that we want our participants to articulate in most games. What actions clearly is tied to the objectives? Why might they work? Why didn't you choose others? These are all the types of questions that we want to know. And then caveats. We end it by asking what kind of wild cards might change your perspective? What things might get you to change your mind? What did you consider but not pursue? Again, those things are kind of cutting room floor in some games, but for us, I think that those things are important because they give us some idea into the reasoning that goes into making these decisions. And also, once you see what was considered and not chosen, those are important things if you want to adjust the strategy. We don't think that these games are going to produce this game isn't going to lead directly to to a new strategy or new approach. It's going to inform that discussion, and having an idea of what was not taken is also important.
I just want to throw into this, really important, just to build on what Tate was talking, was injects, right? Yeah. So everyone just kind of thinks injects are just a part of the game, you just throw it in, right? But you got to question, what does he inject for, right? And there's a lot of different purposes for injects in and of itself, but one of them is to test the decision making, right? So you're changing the parameters. So people make a calculus of the situation, a political calculus, risk versus reward and whatever else. The inject can shift that calculus, and in doing so, their shift in response tells you something, right? So if it's something like, they wouldn't, Russia has done X, but you're not doing anything else, then you say, okay, well, analytically, we can draw a line to say this is not a sufficient trigger point for us. But if you add something else on and they do respond, well, okay, so there's a trigger point between those two, so you're bracketing, right? And this is not rocket science. This is not any great genius insight, but it comes back to that intentionality of thinking about what are we trying to do, what are we trying to understand, and why. It's a research tool to answer questions. Every facet of the design should tie back to how is it helping us answer the question better. And it might be talking about earlier about deconflicting or lowering the pressure. Maybe you're doing it to lower the pressure, right? So you're trying to build the two blue teams up to conflict, and then you change something in the inject. Maybe they got more resources now, right? So they're going to fight over a certain resource, but they're going to go head to head. And then you add a resource in, and then that tension goes away, right? Again, that teaches you. And then as a facilitator, that's going to be the first question you ask. Why was there so much tension with limited resources? Why did that added amount change the calculation for you? Could you have gone about it differently the first time round if you just thought differently about the resources? That's where all this it's a web of design elements and of thinking and of the way you go about it and the way you execute it should be at every stage of this. Why am I adding this in? Why is this aspect there? Why am I telling them this piece of information? What reaction do I expect from them? Why do I want that reaction? And then what does that reaction tell me from an analytical point of view? And that's where you get to the final report. You start pulling all those things out and thinking about it. But
yeah, and the only thing I'd add to this slide is that time is always a factor, right? So obviously not every move is going to, well, I mean, you can make moves as long as they need to be, but at the same time, you're not always going to have people for a week or even a couple of days. So if you try and do these types of games in a day, then clearly you need to really focus these questions and facilitate their discussion very tightly, because I've certainly been part of games where you get stuck on one of these things and you just go down a rabbit hole, and all of a sudden you've got 10 minutes and you got to fill out 2 slides, and that is less constructive way to do it. So one of the great features of games is they are time compressed. They force people to invoke intuition and make decisions, but sometimes that process can get messy if it's not tightly controlled. So next slide. Yeah, so this has actually been touched on. So we left it here, having the feeling that we would have already touched on these points, but it's maybe worth a very quick review, just to hammer home some of these key points. And there's actually a couple points on here that I think are new, but hey, the most important components of games, and John listed his order. I agree with that. I think it really does, though, start with, hey, do we have clear and achievable objectives? And then you can go from there. And then you start to develop the teams and develop the facilitation strategy and game management strategy based on what you're trying to achieve. I have jokingly put in coffee and cookies because that's kind of one of the coffee and donuts, or, a key part of a game is, and I know that's a little dismissive, but it is worth noting that because it's a human experience, it is important to make sure that we are considering, we're doing things to make it comfortable for people to participate. If that's, as John mentioned, there are times in which he's designed games to make it more difficult for teams to communicate with one another. But look, the space and the pace of the game matters too. I've participated in a game once that was held in a hotel, and again, we were on different, the facilitation team, the white cell was on a different floor than most of the other teams. And so it was always kind of a long walk, and it slowed down some of the interactions between the teams in particular. So these things, they're again mundane, but ultimately when people look back at a game, they're going to remember that the air conditioner didn't work, or as much as anything else, if there's something that really is very off on the space and the pace of the game.
One other thing about that is lunch breaks, right? Like, where do you want to break the conversation? Because if people are on a flow with a certain discussion, you don't want to suddenly stop them and have them go and have a lunch break and come back and forget it, right? And that can actually be a really awkward part, because how long do you want the plenary session at the end of the day? How much of the introduction at the start of that? That it seems silly, but the mathematics of trying to figure out that programmatic stuff is a really important element, because you're trying to facilitate in the best way possible a substantive conversation and discussion. And those sorts of things can break people's concentration. They can change the way they think about it. Are they going to be sleepy after lunch? Are they going to be, they're going to get hangry right at the point that you're having the most important, negotiations? Maybe you want that. Again, maybe you're building friction for that particular point. Yeah. Again, no right answer, but you've got to think about every aspect of that.
Yeah, that's right. And as I think Rex just chimed in, they can also break up conversations, because you could have something really good going, and once again, hey, it's 10:15, we've got a break for coffee, which again, there are ways to maybe avoid that. But again, at some point, people are going to have to get up and go use the facilities, go get coffee, do all that stuff. So just think about that during the game design. It also reinforces the absolute criticality of dry runs, at least one, but potentially more once the game design kind of comes into focus, and to have the ability to tour the facility and to run the AV and do all the crazy things that need to be done before a game, to make sure that when you show up, everything
works. The other thing about that is some people let it run too long, right? There's a point at which I know that I switch off, lose concentration, stop caring. If you've got a 2.5 hour breakout session, you're wasted an hour of people's time, right? Like, people have a limit, and it's the same thing with lectures and whatever else. Be realistic about it. How long can people really have a substantive, deep, mentally draining conversation before it starts, tapering off? So, all those things. Again, it might be silly, but it's not. It comes down to humans. It's humans making decisions, having the conversation, and you're designing it to get the best out of them.
Yeah, and I think summing up, as someone just added, via AARs, maybe before big breaks, I think, every plenary, needs to have a few minutes at the end that suggests, look, what are the big things that we've taken away from this move, and getting at least team leads involved in that, because, it helps the rapporteurs, number one, capture the insights in a coherent way. But I think it gets everybody reset before you go to the break on what the big things are. And then when you come back, maybe reiterate those things, put together a slide during the break, and here are the 5 things we talked about at the end. Now let's move on to move 2 or move 3 or whatever the situation is. Next slide.
So I'm going to pause here. We have a few more questions before we get into our case studies. So real quick, do you have any tips or tricks to stop game participants from playing with policies rather than possibilities?
By policies, what do you mean? Like playing with the rules of the game, or the playing technicalities? Honestly,
I want to say like technicalities as well as pre-existing notions.
Yeah,
I won't name the individual because this is going to be recorded, but there was someone in my very first war game that I named this the something effect after. My very first time as facilitator, I was new to all of this, and we're doing this Neo game, looking at evacuating out of a 2006 Lebanon type situation, and we created a fictitious enemy, fictitious country. We'd abstracted, going back to the abstraction, we deliberately abstracted. And again, that's a decision in itself, right? Do you want to look at real life or to abstract? Quite often I prefer to abstract, specifically because of this reason. You get an expert on Japan, and if you say Japan such and such, they will start going to the prime minister in the last 5 years has really, and like that's not really useful when you're future casting or you're doing an alternate scenario or whatever else. So abstraction can be a really powerful tool. We make fake countries, say, well, Japan doesn't exist. That's not a real country in this environment. And that's, I've done it multiple times, right? So yes, that might be the reality, but that's not, we don't want to know what the real world thing is. We want to understand what the possibilities are in alternate universe. Again, it comes back to why you're doing it. So the abstraction is a powerful part of it. But then sometimes as a facilitator, you have to say, I get it, move on. And in this case, that first activity I did, they wanted to talk about why in the scenario document, there should have been a larger civil society because we said that the GDP of the country was X, and that studies have shown that once GDP surpassed that amount, that civil society grew by this percentage amount, and blah, 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 blah. And I went, yeah, I get it. I don't care, right? That's interesting. It's not valuable. That's not what we're here for, right? So that line is one I use a lot, right? What is interesting and what is valuable? If someone's got a good point, but it doesn't achieve the end, I say, thank you. That's really interesting, but that's not what we're here to achieve for. Stay on target, right? And move it off. So again, it comes back down to the facilitation. It comes back down a little bit to the scenario and game design, is that you might have to think about that ahead of time and abstract and design it in a way that won't come up or might not come up. And then you mitigate it, with a facilitator throughout.
Yeah, and I think also other just tips. I mean, there are lots of ways to do this, but one that I, turn it back on the group and say, does everyone, does this what everyone thinks, or are we good putting that on a slide? I mean, kind of forcing that interaction. You are going to get people in any small group dynamic that are going to have very strong opinions and are going to be very forceful in conveying those. I think when you do the team makeup, you have to take that into consideration and maybe counterbalance that with others. And again, you don't want this to get ugly, and it very rarely actually does it. Most people stay within the, stay within the lines. But it's kind of turning it back on the rest of the team to give them an opportunity, and to bring it back to, hey, you're playing this role in this abstraction, this representation. Is this is either out of bounds, or does everyone agree with it? So
I just want, while we're kind of talking about structure and stuff, I just want to bring up Clyde's point from the chat, which is really important and spot on, which is to say that, when you do the plenary sessions can be really important, right? So in some cases, you want to do a plenary after each turn and maybe an AAR after each turn, if that's what you're trying to do. It might be that you have different scenarios and you want to try and play the same technologies or the same, processes or whatever else under different environments, see how they're different each time. But there are other times where you might want them to get to the end of the whole process and then chart. And again, it's all trade-offs, right? If you wait to the end of 2 days and then ask them something that happened in the first one, they might have forgotten it. But, if you have a plenary early on, that may then impact or change or shift their thinking for the next one. So again, we'll say this over and over again until, you're all sick of our voices. There is no right or wrong approach to it. It is all, what are the trade-offs and what best fits what you're trying to achieve and the objectives, that Tate's got here in the hierarchy. What are we trying to achieve and why? Yes, it could be done another way. Yes, it might be done better another way in a different circumstance. It's all up to you and your sponsors and your team and whoever's involved to have a really clear understanding of what are you trying to do and what's the best way to get there, and to think through, again, every aspect of it. When do you break? When do you talk about it? When do you reflect? How do you capture? Do you have a facilitator in the room with them to guide it, or do you want them to have raw discussions amongst themselves? Every aspect of that is up for grabs, and you need to intentionally think about it in terms of how it gets you to the end state you want. Yeah.
And that's a really good point about where to insert facilitation, where to insert wargaming team white cell involvement in your game. And so one of the questions that one of our participants had was, do you find the more dense your problem set or the subject matter that you're trying to game, the more complex, et cetera, requires more involvement from the wargaming team, or is that kind of built into your design?
No, I think it does. And again, it depends on the type of people that are there. So some of the early war games I did were these really technical, or like heavy technology things, right? So we wanted to see, I think we had 5 technologies, again, this is 10 years ago, 3D printing, lasers or directed energy, AI, robotics. And at the time, 10 years ago, that was fairly cutting edge. We could only find 3 experts on 3D printing in the country at the time, right? So people didn't have an understanding of it. So again, you go into it thinking about, okay, so that is a risk, that's a problem. How do we mitigate it? So what we did was that we started every war game with a briefing, not just about the scenario, but about the technologies and the state of the art. And that was a mitigation technique to mean that everyone had a base level of knowledge, right? And then what we did was, you can split teams different ways. You could split them as blue and red. You can split them as geographic. You could split them, do you mix up all the different experts together, or do you have all the military people and all the technologists together? Are we trying to understand the difference between technologists thinking about it and military people thinking about it, or are we trying to think about technologists themselves? And what we did in that case, which was right for that game, was that we mixed some technologists with some military types. And because of that, and the reason was we needed a subject matter expertise and someone saying, no, that is not physically able to be done. Gravity will ruin it, or if we're doing lasers, the atmospherics will interfere. If you just have a bunch of colonels and majors who don't understand that, you might not get that nuance. So we had to put those technologists in the room with the military, but of course, we're not going to get a military concept out of technologists because it's not their field. So that's why you need. So in that case, it was really critical to have a facilitator, and a facilitator with a depth of understanding of both sides of it, so they can be the bridge between. Right. And in that same war game series, in a different war game, we did it completely differently. We put all the different types of subject matter experts. We put all the lawyers in one side and all the policymakers in another, because that's what we wanted to see, was a difference between lawyers and policymakers on the same scenario. So again, you can break it up a lot of different ways. You can mix and match. And yeah, I mean, the more complex it gets, almost the more essential a facilitator is. But they may not be essential if what you're trying to get is raw interactions that you'll then delve into in the plenary session. Yeah. Right. So you can shift the focal point all over the place.
Yeah, and I think you can also embed some of that deep subject matter expertise if you need to into the white cell. Right. So if the facilitator doesn't have the answer and there's a disagreement about, for example, the physics of something, you can have a technologist on the white cell who can be available to make determinations and make the call about what is possible and what isn't, if it's not already built into the scenarios and the injects and things. The other thing I'd highlight is, look, we haven't really talked about it, although it is on this slide, and that's the read aheads. I'm not sure everyone reads the read aheads, but they can be really helpful as well in kind of taking, at least adding, giving some direction to the facilitators and to the teams on, these are some of the big issues that we're going to address. Now, again, it doesn't bound the discussion. As long as it doesn't bound the discussion, that's okay. But read aheads are, I think, very effective. But I don't think, if you make a 200-page read ahead, it's probably not going to get read. In fact, I had very early in my career had a sponsor ask us to put in fake weapons capabilities into the orders of battle, including like cans of high grade whoop ass or something, something like that. So sorry about the language, but and no, like out of 100 participants, 15 said something about it. But these were 250-page documents. So keeping the read aheads to something that's digestible but still relevant, I think also can help the facilitators and maybe take some of the pressure off. Maybe. So, next slide. So these are some of the categories of, the types of games and problems that we've been either individually or collectively asked to design games around. And again, we just wanted to highlight that there is a real breadth of applicability for this wargaming, tabletop exercise, seminar-based wargaming methodology. One of the areas that both of us have been sort of strangely frequently asked to look at is competitive strategies, right? Using this type of exercise to understand the dimensions and asymmetries, which of course are the core of competitive strategies of a specific competitions, and to develop those strategies and understand, again, what sort of components of that strategy were considered and not acted on. Business hedging strategy exercises. Again, we got a couple of good examples on the next few slides, but how can businesses get ahead of possible disruptive dynamics, whether they're geopolitical, economic, technological, industry, market? How do they get ahead of them, and how do you build hedging strategies? Again, a lot of times this involves a hybrid type exercise where you start with scenario planning and you identify a few scenarios that you think are either going to be most disruptive or potentially most likely, and then you play those out, or some combination of them. But this is a really effective tool that we've seen employed by businesses. Same with business development. I mentioned market entry strategies or new business development strategies. I've also seen these run by companies, defense industry companies in capture as part of capture teams, like red team war games, to understand what their competition, what their proposals or their offerings might look like, and how to counter them. Technology games, that's another really frequent area that John and I have been engaged to design games. Yeah, how can they create new advantages? What are the challenges to integration, to moving from a technology to an operational capability? Political and social.
Sorry, just one part I want to pull out there is, people don't often think about this as wargaming. It's often thought as testing this out or seeing what might happen. But ideation is a really important, objective or task that you can use wargaming for, particularly around the technology, right? And this is, again, where it kind of aligns with the design thinking processes is if they're developed properly and if they're done right, it can actually be used to develop new concepts of operation, new ideas, new applications for technology. And I think that often gets forgotten, not by everyone, but, a lot of people who are more used to the more traditional tabletop, board game, forces type thing. It can actually be a really powerful ideation process.
Yeah, that's right. I totally agree with that. So again, we have been engaged to design games for all sorts of different, and this is not the complete list, but these are really, I think, sort of interesting, diverse set of examples. And if you go to the next slide, we can start to talk through some actual case studies. Although, to be fair, we've already mentioned a lot of these, so hopefully, we'll add something new here. But competitive strategy. So I'll tell you a game that a series of games again that benefited from the iteration. Educational games designed to better understand competitive dynamics between U.S., China, and the MilTech development and what it means for the U.S. defense industrial base. So what sort of measures should the DoD and U.S. government take to deepen first of all, pivot defense industrial base to some more modern technologies, fourth industrial revolution technologies, and also whether or not there's room for more engagement with regional allies and partners. And we ran 2 one-day games over the course of 2 months. The first game was 2 blue teams. So if you were DoD, what would your decisions be? And again, really interesting to see the convergences and divergences between these 2 teams, which again, the makeup was intentional in terms of people who in terms of subject matter expertise, and also more or less personality, who we thought was going to speak up and who might be might choose their moments to engage a little bit more carefully. The second game took the outputs of the first game, and then we had teams play kind of allies and partners in the region. And the first move was really about building a profile of what these teams' capabilities were, where their strengths and weaknesses were in terms of their defense industrial capability, what their constraints were in terms of engaging with the United States, also engaging with China. And we played it out from that perspective. We played sort of these green and brown teams, allies and partners, over the course of the rest of the day. So really interesting exercise that I think, again, the analytical output was good. It was really helpful in terms of understanding where some of the asymmetries are and where some of the opportunities for engagement are. But I think it was designed as an educational game. So I think for the folks who attended that game, both of those games, it was really helpful to see how that process can create new insights. A second game, business strategy case. This was many years ago. Was part of a kind of a combined team at a company I used to work at that brought together expertise from security and defense, energy, the automotive industry, macroeconomics, and we ran a almost year-long project. It was kind of an iterative hybrid exercise that played out. We would develop 3 very long scenarios, like big, detailed stories about the future, and then as we engaged with the organizations that signed up to this kind of multi-client study, each of them said, what does this mean for me? And then, there were war games runs, sort of these sorts of tabletop exercises run to get what these scenarios meant in terms of them developing hedging strategies around big technological, geopolitical, and economic disruptions. And it was one of the most interesting things I've ever been a part of. So, and I think it was really successful in terms of not just giving the big picture to these organizations, which was the first part of the hybrid exercise, but then actually drilling down and saying, this is material to the way you run your business going forward. I've already mentioned this market entry exercise, which was really great because what it did, some of these reveal the strengths of exercises, some of them reveal the challenges. And I think a couple of things that came out of this was one, the enormous value of having kind of ringers in the room, because in each group, we knew that this organization wasn't terribly familiar with the US government marketplace. So we had facilitators who were kind of neutral on that topic, who had experienced the US government marketplace, had some interaction with it and some opinions on it, but we put participants, full participants in there who had served in roles that were really relevant to the conversation and told them to be devil's advocates, right? So we told them to challenge the assumptions of these individuals with their knowledge. And I think that was really effective in helping both teams to see that they were not set up to do business to prime in the federal marketplace. It was one of the more revealing exercises I've ever been a part of because it took an organization that thought they were on the cusp of being very successful and made them rethink their organizational structure, which I think now they are much more successful as a result of many other decisions, no doubt. But this, I think, was a contributor to that. Next slide, please. John, I think this is over to you, this slide.
Yeah, so I kind of touched on this a little bit about the technology side of things. So this was really interesting. I want to use this as an example, talk about the series of games, right? So again, when I started out doing this wargaming stuff for OSD, we thought we were going to take a very kind of traditional tabletop, here's a map, let's move forces around type thing. And more and more we strayed away from that because it just wasn't getting us the answers or exploring the areas that we wanted to get to, right? So we kind of came up with this kind of meta game, and it was mentioned in the chat that this happens in miniatures wargaming and stuff, this kind of like game within a game type structure. It's nothing new in that sense, but for me, it's always the ideal. Unfortunately, it's rarely what you get to do because people don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they want to just kind of do a war game. I hate single war games. I mean, they can be useful, but you rarely get the same level of insight or knowledge or thought that you get if you're doing series. And if you know you have a series over time, you can really kind of break them up to answer different questions, right? So in this case, we were talking about technologies, the game-changing technologies I referred to earlier, 3D printing and those sorts of things. But rather than just saying like, okay, let's just do 3 war games, what we did was each war game had 4 scenarios across the spectrum of warfare. So there was a gray zone type war game or regular warfare type game. There was a conventional land, conventional maritime, and then there was some sort of other complex scenario. So in some of them we had like there was a weapons of mass destruction program in a rogue state, and how could we eliminate it? Using some of these technologies, or some creative ways of doing it. There was another one that I think was seizing. It was an irregular maritime, it was something to do with the Senkaku Islands type thing. So we did different scenarios, but in each game, so the games didn't have multiple terms for the scenarios. They had multiple scenarios, which were kind of the turns, and then the games themselves became the turns. And so we had, the first game was kind of definitional. We used scenarios to talk about what do we mean by different types of technologies, what defines game changing or not. And it was really it was more of a workshop really that was, with a scenario element to it to define the technologies and the game changing and draw bounds around. It was really an exploratory, formative type activity. The second game, we did a fairly conventional blue game. We did it at Carlisle at the War College there. It was almost all completely, US military types. And we broke them out, and we had, the colonels and the planners and the J5 types. And we gave them different technology and said, here's some scenarios you might encounter. How would you employ them? The year is 2025 or 2030 or whatever it was. How would you use these technologies based on your learning of or understanding of how you would do operations today? All right. And then we had a baseline for, how we would use the technologies. The next one we did was a red team game. So it wasn't a red teams playing playing blue teams. The game was all red teams. We took it the entire game, and we actually, instead of giving them a scenario and saying, what would you do? We gave them an end state. So we showed them this video of like a massive terrorist attack and said, this just happened in 2040. You're now in 2020. How did you get to this point? What things did you do to achieve that? And we kind of walked them backwards from the end state, rather than saying, what would you do with these things, is how would you use these things to get the end state we've already given you? So we reversed it. And that was, the participants there was really important. We had like Hollywood directors, we had like Silicon Valley tech, bros. We had some foreign officers. We had like a Yemeni special forces guy. Really diverse. We had a guy who was a specialist on Mexican drug cartels. who knew how they operated. So we had lots of really different voices, and we had almost no US military in the room, specifically because we didn't want to take them with, well, that's not how you do it. And if you JPCOA, if you the JP 3.0 says you should X, Y, and Z, and you haven't considered that, Congress, we didn't want that. We wanted complete blue sky. If you are unconstrained by our values, bureaucracy, political events, all those sorts of things, what would you do? If the sky's the limit, what would you do? If you're genuinely trying to be as evil as possible, how could you employ it? Because our enemies are not going to fight our way. They're not going to be constrained by our values and whatever else. So we had to look at the outside of it. The last game was to look at the legal, moral, and ethical implications. And so we had lawyers there. We had Human Rights Watch guys there. I think we had a Hindu priest or something there. We had all sorts of different types that had, religious and legal and moral and policy and societal perspectives, and put them in the room, and then took some of the findings from the last games to challenge them and get them to critique and find the flaws in them. So we could say, we're going to do this, our enemy's going to do this. Where would the problems be, and how would that evolve, and how would that change, and then how might you alter the way you would apply it for that reason, and why can how can we see that there's a problem before we get to there being a problem? And there was some technology examples I'll give later on to anyone who's interested as to what was driving our thinking on that. There are other games that I've looked at where you say, like, let's take one scenario but play it with 4 different participant groups. I was wanting this a few years ago. We never got around to doing it, but let's do one with your standard US defense military policy people, right? And that's your baseline of that's how you would solve that problem. And it almost didn't matter what the scenario was. Then let's do a different one where we take the midshipmen from Annapolis who have a military mindset but aren't yet burdened by 10 or 20 or 30 years of groupthink. And how would they, what would they come up with? Then let's go out to a university in California or Seattle or something and take all young people and let them go nuts with the creativity. They might not come up with very good concepts of operation of how you employ it in war. Maybe they would come up with some way of avoiding the war to begin with. Who knows? Don't know. That's the whole point, is let's explore the what ifs and really open it up. And then there was going to be another game we're going to look at crowdsourced ideas, which I have a complex, relationship with crowdsourced anything, and that's a whole other TED talk. Or we'll take it to Europe and we'll do it with NATO allies, because they're going to see the world differently with different cultural values. You can see in the AUKUS discussions this week, I told you we'd get to submarines. You can see that a lot of the frictions between the French cultural way of their defense department and contractors doing things in the Australian ones caused huge risks, which led us to this point. So they're going to see things different. They're going to have a different moral structure. They're going to have a different logic structure. And so you take things around. So there's a lot of different ways you can play with it. But that technology game was a good example. And I think it's really important when you're talking about technology, in particular futures technology, is that you really think about ways of opening the aperture, opening the creativity, and giving ways to develop new ideas.
Yeah, and John, just quickly on the red team, and kind of more perspectives and playing games with different sort of categories of experiences, right? I do training on alternative futures and red teaming and wargaming and scenario planning. And one of the examples for red teaming that I use comes out of a terribly tragic event, the 2012 attack on the Camp Bastion in Afghanistan, and the Taliban getting through the wire and all that. And what came out of that, though, was some reporting that the Marines basically said, we're going to form this dirt track red team, is what they called it, and it was going to prioritize not senior officer participation, but enlisted person participation, individuals who are playing a lot of video games, who are going to think about all of the creative ways that their video games may be able to inform, some of the tactics and operational concepts that the Taliban might use on subsequent attacks on Camp Bastion and others. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of that, and I wish I could remember the Marine's name who said this, but it was, I don't mind if someone comes to me and says, and asks me why this happened, and I'm able to say we thought about it but didn't think it was going to happen. I'm much more upset if I say that we didn't think about it at all. And I think engaging different, again, categories of experiences, age groups, all that sort of thing can be really useful, depending, again, on the objective of what the exercise is designed to achieve.
Just as a kind of a tangent to that, I did a war game a couple of years ago. So well, it wasn't really a war game. So I think we're using what's it called, metaphorical, can't remember the term, a table basically. It's basically a matrix, right? So you have a one axis as threats, one is actors, and we basically did like a line by line, 9x9 grid, so what would a cartel do with robotics? What would a cartel do with AI, et cetera, et cetera? And we kind of explored all these different things, different scenarios as an ideation activity. It wasn't a true war game in that sense. But one of the things that came up in the plenary discussion is someone said, I think the greatest, and this is probably about 2014 or 2015, I think the greatest threat to national security we haven't talked about yet, right? Going to Tate's thing about like asking the end, what have we missed? What else is out there? I think one of the greatest threats to US security is, or to national security is lack of critical thinking on social media. And there's a part of me that went, that's really deep. What does that look like? I don't know. There's a part of me that probably went, oh, this is just some crotchety old middle-aged guy who just doesn't like Facebook, right? But, fast forward a year or two, we know exactly how that manifests. So, signal and noise, it seemed like it was noise. It seemed like it was maybe important noise, but someone had put the answer, whether that was just their one belief or whether that had come about by the different interactions of discussions or that triggered a feeling or whatever else or a thought. I don't know. But someone had given us on a plate that answer that would 2 years later become, in some ways, another 9/11 in terms of having a strategic shock about what changes the world and the way we do things and how we think about the world. And it was right there on a platter, and we missed it because we either didn't have the creativity or we didn't have the prescience to recognize it for what it was and jump on it, right? So there is a signal and noise issue, right? You're going to get a lot of noise in these things. It's very hard to sift through and pick the signals. And that's where a lot of the facilitation, again, comes in, and the analysis at the end of it. You can go and ask a bunch of university students how they think we should run a war, and you're going to get a lot of nonsense. And, but there is going to be some nuggets in there. And sometimes that might be worth it. Again, it goes back to what's the point? Maybe the creativity, maybe trying to find that rare signal is worth whatever, extra noise you get along with it. So,
John, do you want to just very quickly, because I think we're under half an hour now, but we don't have a lot left to do. We've only got really one more substantive slide, but just quickly talk about this understanding implications of elections outcomes, because I think there are a couple of, regardless of the topic, which I know can be sensitive, and we're not here to make judgments about that. But it is interesting to reveal some of the challenges that go into exactly what you're talking about, which is some of these social media dynamics in particular.
Right. And this is a really interesting challenge. And when I was first approached by a mutual friend of the people who wanted to run it, for me, the real motivator was that it was a really interesting methodological challenge, right, that I wanted to explore. And so the kind of design brief was, we think there is the pandemic, there is disinformation, there is, a rise in domestic terrorism, there is all these things, there's rising partisanship, there's all these elements that will go into destabilizing a possible transition. And in the past, particularly 2000 was what drove a lot of thinking, there was a lot of people who were unprepared for it. So we want to look at what all the possible outcomes might be, so that we can at least be pre-warned, right? We can have considered what may happen. And it was never meant to be predictive. It was never meant to say, this is what, it wasn't meant to develop a plan for we're going to do this, this, and this because we think this is going to happen. It was really about exploring as many different possibilities. And so I came up with a number of different ideas for how to get at it. But really, it was always going to be a matrix game, because a matrix game allows you to really, it focuses not just on what the outcomes are. The outcomes are almost irrelevant. Rex, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the outcome is almost irrelevant in the matrix game. It's a really good way of delving into that human decision making and the thinking behind it. It allowed a chance to really explore how do people respond to different stimulus. What are they thinking? What are their priorities? How do they break down the challenge? And so that's why we took that approach. And it ended up being 4 matrix games of half day each, which was pretty short, and they were really, really compressed, and would have been a lot better if we could have expanded out. They had to be virtual, which was really interesting experience in itself, because that enabled a lot more people to take part, but changed some of the dynamics, constraints about how you do it, what the time frame is. So instead of having a jam all into 2 days, you could do it over multiple weeks and such. And there were some really interesting parts of the design of scenarios. There was, contested in both directions. There was contested a different scope. And the idea was, if this outcome is different to that outcome, why is it different? What is the difference about it? Is it because one person won and one person didn't? Or if the same person won, but there's different outcomes, is it because of the scale of it, right? And so I think in one game, and correct me if I'm wrong, But I think one of, in both the games where there was a landslide victory, there wasn't a lot of disruption in that game because there wasn't a lot of things you could do. It was only when it was close that could have reflected reality. The only way you could have done that is to do a series of, surveys or focus groups using the outcomes of the game, and the time compression didn't allow that. That would have been really good. You have the outcome of the games, you put it to a focus group. The focus group tells you which thing they think and why, and then you use that as your adjudication. We couldn't do that, so we had to rely on dice and other random things to drive it, and the white cell to drive it. But the two other things that we really couldn't do was the courts, because we had lawyers there, we had people playing the courts, but courts are so specific about the filing brief and exactly what the argument is. And unless you give them that, again, the information they need to make a decision, I'm not a lawyer, I couldn't give them that kind of detailed scenario for them to really bounce off. So they kind of went, well, maybe it's this, maybe that. It depends on who's filing, it depends on this, it depends on that. So that wasn't really effective. The other one was, which is a really interesting element, right? So we knew going into this that there's no practical way to play every possible stakeholder in the game. So we had to make artificialities. One of those artificialities was to compress the political parties into kind of one blob. And we said to them, you can pretend to be federal, you can be state, you can be local, you can be whoever you think is the most important at that time in that scenario. And we let them go to it, but because they were playing the same team, there wasn't a lot of friction within the team. If we'd done it again, we probably would have broken them out to being local politicians and federal politicians, because the way the outcomes happen, that's where the real pivot point in real life happened, and where things, some of the worst case scenarios were stopped with those pivots between those people. And the artificialities of the game were never going to allow us to have that degree of fidelity, at least not within the constraints of time and who we had involved and other things. So we knew that was a flaw going in. We mitigated it as best we could, but inevitably that was the one part that we were weakest in the analysis. And I think that speaks a lot to everything we just talked about, the structure and all those sorts of things. If you get those things right, you'll get good outcomes. You can't do everything, so you need to know where your weaknesses are, and then you mitigate the best you can.
Yeah, thanks, John. It was really interesting to observe. I know there were a lot of these types of things that happened in the fall of last year, and it was interesting to see wargaming applied like this. And again, John ran a matrix game, and it was a very good relationship with the sponsor, but it was an interesting exercise to say the least. So, and probably an area that I had not really considered as a primary area where you could apply some of these methodologies, but I think it was interesting. And like I said, lots of people trying to do this. So
one thing I will say about, and this is again another design element that was really difficult, was getting balance, right? The thing with matrix game is if you use dice in particular, it's all about probability, and the probability is modified through argument. But so if you stack one side of it, and I've seen this a lot of times that people try to do this, right? So we're interested in NATO and the Gulf and the West and America and Britain and Australia, right? And then you have like 8 blue teams and then like 2 red teams. Well, of course, the blue team's going to win every time, right? Because they've got more of them. They've got more dice rolls. They've got more modifiers. One of the really key elements in this that we worked very hard to do was to find a way to balance it so that the probabilities were always stacked in a relatively balanced way. Because the intent here was not to see the outcomes. It was to see the arguments people would make. And, steel is forged in fire, in conflict. I mean, that's why you get, that's why Formula One has the best technology, because it's all about competition. By putting them in a competitive environment, you're driving people, you're forcing people, you're triggering their competitive spirit to try and be better than the other guy. And they put the best foot forward because they're trying to beat the other guy, right? And that's the same way through argument. And so that was the best way to drive the sharpest arguments we could, by forcing them through that experiential and competition, forcing them to make the best argument they could. And in that sense, that was always going to be a better way of drawing out those arguments than just like sending out survey. What do you think tonight? Where someone, while sitting with their slippers and robe and smoking a cigar, thinks, oh, well, this will be such and such. You're forcing them to really, compete with the other people, and that forces them to really sharpen their thinking and their articulation.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Some final examples of some of the ways that we've applied this sort of approach to gaming. There's a lot of talk now about how do we model some of these gray zone conflicts. Some people probably tired of that term already, but we're going to use it here anyway. Just the things that are difficult to detect, that are, kind of the blurring of the traditional security and non-security capabilities and interests. We have done a couple of these, but one that I thought was really interesting and ultimately successful was spent a day with a pretty fast moving, but it wasn't really ever overtly military crisis, in which Russia takes some active measures both in the virtual world, digital world, and in the real world to create instability and uncertainty in Eastern Europe. We had, I think, 6 total teams representing key government stakeholder organizations, as well as allies, partners, and of course, Russia playing an active kind of instigator and red team. It was built on outcomes of a game that was 12 months earlier. So it took us a little while to digest those and kind of figure out what we wanted to do next. Some of that was just sort of bureaucratic and administrative challenges, but it ended up being really pretty revealing in much the way that John referenced some of the games earlier, where once you start playing this game and you start trying to coordinate responses that are not just military, and you start trying to coordinate effects that are, from different organizations within the government, you really do run up against kind of some big constraints, and it slowed the game down, and ultimately, I think revealed just how difficult it is to deter these challenges. The other thing it did from a very practical standpoint, deter and respond to, is it sort of demonstrated the limits of technology when incorporated into the game. We were using Slack, I think, or some messaging technology to for the white cell to stay engaged in all 6 of these teams. And of course, we have facilitation members in each of the teams. But the information was coming in a little too fast and furious for us to handle at certain times. And so, the game was very fast moving, as I mentioned earlier, and it became a lot more difficult to try and keep up using the technology than it was just in other ways that we had kind of tried to changing the rules to slow the game down a little bit and get back in. So revealing of those 2 things, as well as the need to be able to adjust on the fly. Every game is going to have its challenges, and I think we had a couple here that we didn't necessarily see coming, but we were able to to make some pretty good adjustments to make this a successful game in the end. I mentioned this first responder exercise. I think what this showed me was it took a while for these first responders to really begin to embrace the idea that their plans, existing plans, which we were trying to test, weren't perfect. They did, and they ultimately became very critical of some components of it. But you have to really start the brief. John mentioned a substantive brief on key topics. I think it also helps to start the brief by talking about what war games are designed to do. We did that, but you have to hammer that home over and over and over again. That look, yeah, your plans may be really, really good, but let's try and poke holes in them. That's part of what we're trying to do here today. It was certainly part of the objective, and I think it took a little while to get both teams that we had involved in that game totally on board with looking at their plans with critical eyes. And then finally, one thing that I did at Jane's every year for 5 years was we ran the future of the Syria-Iraq conflict, and it was one of the most. It was really a great exercise. In large part because we had to draw from across not just Jane's organization. Jane's at the time was owned by a company called IHS. It no longer is, but it was then. And IHS had business lines that were into risk and to energy and economics and all these other vertical areas. And so to incorporate them in these games, was sometimes bureaucratically difficult, but to get 40 people from across the company in a war game for a day and a half was a little bit challenging. But when we did it, when we were able to pull it off, it was really revealing, and I think opened up a lot of insights that were not in the games, because we did this 5 years running. And 2 or 3 of the years we had these big games, and the rest of the time they were much smaller and more defense focused. And you can see a difference in the outputs, right? And just because there wasn't this multidisciplinary focus, it was very much focused on the sort of geopolitical and counterterrorism components. So next slide. Yeah, so this is our last one. And just to sum things up, we see the use of tabletop exercises and this sort of seminar style wargaming as having a real analytical value, sort of a meta value, right? It's about challenging assumptions, testing your plans, figuring out the whys and why nots of why you make decisions. Experiential is one good word, but I don't want to discount the idea that the analytical outputs aren't important or aren't going to help shape decisions going forward. But I think it is really about understanding why you take these decisions as much as it is about the specific decisions that you take. Experience matters in facilitation. That's not to say that John and I are the only people who are experienced. Clearly, that's not the case. That's not the point of saying that. But it does mean that, you know, facilitation is so important to this style of war game that having people who are able to anticipate the problems and then respond to the ones you didn't see is really critical to a successful event. We have harped throughout this on the importance of iterative exercises. Games are most effective when they are iterative and can build off the insights that emerge from previous exercises. And I think a lot of the games that we've talked about today were 1 day or maybe 1.5. You do the full exercise and then come back the next day and talk about what you learned. Not all of them, but some of them. But these really short and sharp exercises that go for like 6 hours maybe can be used as a means of engaging and building buy-in with senior stakeholders and decision makers who maybe don't have 2 days to spend on this. And also can, if you organize it, design it right, facilitate it right, it can produce some really interesting and sometimes even counterintuitive insights. And finally, technology. Building in technology can enhance granularity. I mean, it can be really important. It can be really effective. The gameplay dynamics, but it also can create sort of distractions or new dynamics that hamper game progression. I mentioned earlier, Slack, we kind of became over-reliant on that message system, and it did what it was supposed to do. We just, the game got moving too fast for us to really keep up with. So, and there are other examples of how technology has been integrated in ways that have slowed the game down or have had a counterproductive effect. And again, that's not to say don't integrate it. It just means be careful about how you integrate it and test it, think through any challenges on that front. And John, I'll leave the last word to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I mean, I think you've nailed all of it. And I think we've covered everything as we go. But yeah, I mean, I just reiterate again the how and the why. Sometimes it can be as important as the game outcome itself. It goes back to why you're doing it. This is really, I don't see as games as ends themselves. I see them as tools to further understanding or to explore a topic or to, whatever it is. And so I think if you change that mentality, if you say we're not doing a game because we're doing a game, we're doing a game because we're trying to achieve something else, that helps sharpen that thinking of what is it and why is it and how are we going to do it in order to get to that point. And then again, just the foot stomp, the intentionality of everything, the social engineering aspect of it, like every part of a game matters and there's no right or wrong answer, but you should always know why, right? It's like designing a piece of technology or a car. You don't just put a button in the middle of the dashboard for no reason. There's got to always be a function or a reason or some sort of thinking. You should be able to articulate that as a game designer as to why it is the way it is. And if you can't, then you got to wonder what it's doing there. So yeah, none of this is hard. None of this is really, groundbreaking, Nobel Peace Prize stuff. But it is experience, it is knowledge, it is something we've seen and can be passed on. And I've been lucky enough to see some great facilitators and see some great war gamers early in my career. And I hope to pass that on to others and show it takes the same because we want to see this expand and we want to see more of it. And we want to see it done well because, we really do, think that there is value to it. And the more that it's happening, then the better for all of us to enhance our understanding.
Great. Well, Lexi, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this. Obviously, you get John and I talking on Wargaming, it can go for a long time, but we're always happy to do it and really grateful for everyone spending time on this event.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for attending. If you have any additional questions for our presenters tonight, their contact info is there up on the screen. That's for everyone who's here participating and everyone who is watching online. Thank you again for coming, and for more webinars, etc., please visit our webpage. Thanks.